an inquiry from T. All right, so going to try to deal with this in two different ways, just so folks are clear. One, kind of a historical, theoretical piece that'll do the framing. Then two, talk about the experiment and the attempt to put elements of kind of the overall theory of change employed in Jackson, Mississippi in particular, to realize a particular state of dual power and what we were hoping and aiming to accomplish from that. So there'll be one kind of, theoretical, the other practical, and then the closing piece will be just, I think, some general comments to, in part, I think, try to offer, at least from my vantage point, some clarity on how this term is being kind of misused and misapplied in a lot of the current kind of political dialogue and debate. So just to keep that in mind. Now, I think folks should know this concept, phrase in different iterations across different languages, but particularly with French, Spanish, Italian, German, English, has been a part of kind of your revolutionary radical movements for like well over 200 years. Growing out of anarchists, or what used to be called libertarian movement before that term got hijacked, and socialist and communist movements, largely coming out of the European context of the 19th century. This concept has been one which I think we need to be very clear about, right? Because I think some people pose it in the here and now as like a theory unto itself, rather than a part of a phase of transition of people coming into power. And I think if you kind of theorize it as something within itself, it actually leads you to some dead ends. And we'll talk about that unto itself, rather than seeing it as part of a process. Now, coming out of those traditions, I think there's two moments that most of the world have looked at as kind of the most concrete expressions of the actual implementation of dual power on a critical note. One, of course, being the Paris Commune, 1871, for that brief period of time, which really, I think, for most of the left, particularly in Europe, sharpened a lot of questions that people have been theorizing primarily since the uprising, what they call the Spring of Nations that happened in Europe, particularly in Central Europe, 1848, 1849, 1850, that period of upsurge, which broke up, Habsburg's empire, or at least a fraction of it. Didn't totally topple until, some 70 years later with World War I. But, where folks started to, the kind of the completion of the bourgeois revolution coming out of the French Revolution in particular, started to complete this process in Germany, the Netherlands, Bavaria, Austria, the Alps. And I'm citing all this because it becomes important to know the subject of where these kind of ideas are germinated, right, and why. Then, of course, probably the most clearest articulation and direct articulation of dual power comes from the Russian Revolution, 1917, and particularly the period, the interim period from February to October, right? Remember, there was kind of a two-step process of revolutionary transformation that happened in the Russian Revolution. First was basically the forced kind of abdication, of the monarchy, and the end of the hostilities, at least on the Russian part, in World War I, and where there was basically a kind of an interim government that was put in place, made up of kind of the mishmash of forces, but a revival of the Duma, their equivalent of the Parliament or Congress, if you want to call it that, that got created or kind of institutionalized in the 1905 revolution, but went through phases of being relevant, not relevant, real or not real, depending on where the czar was at. So you had that kind of interim period. And this is the period where, probably one of the most famous revolutionary works of all time was written in kind of a product of, and that's Lenin's State and Revolution. Where he went back and pushed for, no, let's not have this uneasy state of affairs, wherein we kind of allow the bourgeoisie to regroup and reorganize and call it democratic, but let's actually push forward towards, the full completion of the proletarian revolution. So this was something he was actually advocating for in the book. You got to remember, was something that was primarily being written primarily for his comrades in the Bolshevik Party, because he was making some arguments within the party that there were some folks who thought that was a state affair that should have remained, and there were others, initially he and others were in the minority, saying no, we should not. We need to smash the state, and we need to smash the forces that are utilizing it and trying to catalyze it to enshrine bourgeois rule. I'm just kind of giving a summary, but there are many more things that were written in there, including a particular relationship that becomes critical for pretty much the rest of the world, of how self-determination and the grand strategy of revolution, coming from the Bolsheviks, wanted to being articulated. That was one of the first critical pieces that put all of that together. And dual power, at least the argument, and in part an argument of refutation of it, was at the center of that. Now, there were always challenges to that, right? There were challenges, one could say, from the left, from the anarchists, Makhno and some of those other forces who were challenging some of the Lenin's aspects. And then, of course, you got the cadets and some of the other folks who were also challenging from the right, this notion around where and how to move both the state and the society in their context. And there's been a set of running debates, about how to orient oneself towards the state long before this happened, but definitely kind of got aggravated afterwards, right? After the Bolsheviks were successful at overthrowing the bourgeoisie and the rest of the monarchy, effectively in October, right? Debates that we still live with, whether we know it or know it, just in terms of framing what's legitimately revolutionary struggle or what's not. Debates that are probably not going to go anywhere, definitely not after the end of this presentation and discussion. But there's different interpretations of this that have emerged from that point in time that I think bring us to today, right? And I think what I would articulate is there's kind of three general interpretations around dual power, right? So one, if you would, and remind you, these are being overly simplified. But one position is that this is a state of affairs that we should remain in, right? That you should have dual power. And remember, dual power, let me go back and say, dual power in this sense means that there's the power of the state and the power of capital, which are entwined in the personage of the state, in the entity of the state, to institute class rule, right? Basically, the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. And what the dual power means is that you have a people's power that emerges primarily through communes or through assemblies or through Soviets, which is where that term comes from, where working class people, oppressed people, minority groups, women become self-organized and then challenge directly, the power of the state. Now, they can do this challenge, and people do these challenges in a number of different ways. Probably the most common way that has been used, that in part a theory of that brought this very group together, is the utilization of the weapon of the general strike, right? And the point of utilizing that particular weapon is to basically paralyze society interrupt the cycle and the process of capitalist, production and reproduction, and bring the state and capital to heel, to say that, either you concede with certain demands if it's within a demands framework, and not all revolutions have been in a demands framework, but either you concede to these demands, or, we're just going to take this over if we have enough strength to take this over. Now, where these three pieces I'm talking about is when you get to that stage of being strong enough, being organized enough, and have enough of society behind you to execute a general strike, the dual power piece then comes in. What comes after the general strike, right? What comes after? What's the next piece? And typically, when folks have been able to get to that stage of being able to organize and amass that piece, depending, and I would argue, depending on the character of the revolutionary consciousness of the society in question and the revolutionary forces, that could either go into a negotiated state with the powers that be, or an overthrow state of the powers that be. And that is one of the reasons why I cited to show and really highlight this pivotal difference, why I think Lenin was so insightful and so important, remains so important to this day, and why so many people, fall into that tradition historically of articulating, being very clear about, no, we are not going to just stay in a negotiated state of affairs where the bourgeoisie still run. Our aims and objectives are to overthrow this very system, and it means getting rid of their institutional power and everything that comes with it. So that particular orientation, kind of again drawing from the Bolsheviks, was dual power was part of a process, but the end result was to abolish the rule of the bourgeoisie. That's one orientation around dual power and what the purpose of it is. The other position is, like I said before, backing up a little bit, was to maintain a position where this kind of contest between the autonomous forces of society, right, the organized working class and oppressed people, always existing in a state of contest to either hold the state accountable and the forces of capital accountable, but without making the move or making the leap, if you would, to actually take over the state. Then there's another position, which I think is, again, oversimplifying, the position of the dual power should eradicate the state and the contending power of capital, but not seek to create another state apparatus, right? And so those are your three, right? Overthrow the state and replace it with, the organized, power of the working class, and oppressed people. That's number one. Two, kind of, stay in a consistent state of bargaining, but not overthrow those forces. And three, smash the state, but don't replace it with kind of another state apparatus. Now, where do people land on that? The central question is, where do you really, what's your theory of social transformation, right? And a lot of it pivots on how soon and by what means you believe, for whatever reason, the institution like the state will be needed to catalyze and organize society, right? So you kind of, I would argue, again, oversimplifying this kind of the traditional, and let me put it this way, there's sometimes an exaggerated debate between communists and Marxism about the state, which I think everybody here knows. But if for those who kind of really read Marx was not a big fan of the state. I don't know where people kind of got that confused in his own writing. He was not one fan of the state, but he just saw it as basically an instrument that emerged under historic circumstances, several thousand years back, that it was a parasitic piece, but that it was necessary at least in this stage of human development and technological advance, even under capitalism, to kind of organize large-scale social transactions, large-scale pieces and that society, in his view, was going to have to organize, first through kind of the proletarian revolution to basically wither the state away. So it's not true that they were trying to create a state. He was particularly trying to create a state edifice to stay in existence for perpetuity, but saying that we had the level of the productive forces in human consciousness and transformation of that was going to have to get us to a particular place where the state would no longer be needed. And so the more anarchist sense is, why wait? Let's just get rid of the damn thing, to the best degree possible. And the question becomes in both, well, how do you get there? In truth, neither one of those traditions have ultimately figured that out. We've had a bunch of experiments, which we had a bunch of experiments, if you include like Spain, if you include some living ones now, like what's going on with the Zapatistas or Rojava, whatever, where you kind of have movements that have existed or created zones that kind of exist somewhat outside of the official power and authority of the state, but they have not succeeded in socially, creating a broad social transformation for everybody in their own societies, let alone the world. So we're still experimenting at this. And each experiment has something that I think to teach us without despairing it. We need to recognize the mistakes and the failures, of course, from our own vantage points and learn from them. But getting rid of this system has proven to be much harder than I think many people kind of ideally thought it was. And that's something we got to learn from, not to be ashamed from. So so that's your kind of your three outline. But the question of it is, at the end of the day, it requires the movement to be able to amass enough power and strength to do a direct confrontation with the state and with the forces of capital for there to be anything remotely considering something to be in a state of dual power. That is something I think that we need to just forcefully correct with everybody who's out there trying to use that term and that phrase, right? Now, that brings us to kind of the experiment in Jackson and us using that term. Now, we always, tried to make a distinction that we were talking about a lower stage of implementation and in the Jackson kind of Kush Plan experiment. The purpose of how we were using that term was we wanted to make sure that we were building the autonomous kind of governance infrastructure of the people to be able to hold the government accountable. Now, we kind of left it there very intentionally. We thought this was something that we could accomplish on a municipal level, but it was short of actually attaining state power. And we made a distinction between being in office and holding state power. And let me make it very clear to anyone, at least from my perspective, and I can say clearly from what we articulate from Cooperation Jackson, being in office is not having state power. Far from it, right? You become, when you hold office through kind of electoral process in the system that we are subject to, you just become, in effect, another force trying to manage the contradictions of capital. That's really what you are, whether if you're a governor, if you're a mayor, if you're a president, that's what you're really trying to do. And that's all that you fundamentally solved up. Recognizing, I think, radical and revolutionary forces should recognize that the contradiction of capital cannot be managed. And so if we're going to be in these positions, and this is how we were trying to initially articulate it, if you're going to be in these positions, your job is to fundamentally enable the people's assemblies and the things of that nature to have greater agency and greater democratic space in which to operate in, to then move on the contradictions, to move them and advance them in a more radical stage, not try to manage. And it's this management dynamic. Unfortunately, I think that if we look at what's happening in Buffalo, if we look at where most of the DSA is, we look at even things in Jackson, I don't think we've been able to this point, at least in the United States and most everywhere else, come to a deeper understanding of dual power in this sense of being able to move the elected officials out into a real framework of advancing and heightening the contradictions rather than trying to manage the state. And what I mean by manage the state and manage the affairs is everybody gets in and is like, okay, I have to figure out, how to best deliver services, how to best deliver, trash services or fix potholes or make sure the buses run on time. All these things run within the framework of managing the contradictions of capital, y'all. Let's be very clear about that. Because if you just are in the orientation of just trying to figure out how to improve it, you kind of got two ways to go given the present dynamics, right? If you're not going to ultimately change the framework. One is you're trying to make the state more effective and efficient, or you say that the state can't handle this and you privatize the services, you privatize things, and you contract it out. Those are the two ways that you can go, right? Because anything else winds up putting you in a revolutionary perspective of saying, how do I transfer the ownership of the overall means of production, which is not written in anybody's constitution, not written in anybody's framework, that they're going to allow you to do, right? Without then sending some federal troops or the National Guard to come deal with your ass and pull you out of that office. But this is the ultimate challenge of what we are asking people to do. And the reason why you have to have a clear understanding and interpretation of dual power, that I would argue from our experience where we've fallen short, is when she holds office, say the mayor is trying to push for something like that, who's going to have their back? Right? Who's going to be at that front line of saying you're not removing this person from office? And not only you're not removing this person from office, but we've actually already, say, seized, the different means of production and executed and democratized them, and turned them into commons, and the people are holding, different types of assemblies in either at their workplaces or in the communities to determine, collectively how the goods and services and all those different things are going to be mediated, managed, and affair. So that's the broader sense of when we mean by dual power in this more limited sense, it was to heighten the contradiction, right? And to move the system beyond. And for us, just to be clear, there was two kind of objectives. One objective coming out of our particular framework within the New African Independence Movement was to advance the national independence struggle, right? It was to catalyze this and move what was going on in Jackson to actually be a further step in taking concrete steps of freeing the land, and then from there setting up sovereign and independent nation state apparatus, but to be as a broader catalyst for the decolonization of the American empire and the socialist transformation of what remained or what would fall out from that empire. Like, very clear on that. But being clear on that rhetorically and being clear on that practically, there's some gaps and some steps that I think we mixed, and we ran into some contradictions about that we are all learning from, myself deeply included, about certain assumptions that I know I made that everybody was on the same page, when in reality we wasn't, right? Or we thought that we meant this and we meant this together, but in truth that we didn't. And these are just growing pains of these experiments. They're going to be in everyone. Any revolutionary process you've seen in history, you see these type of things going down. So it's not like it's something particularly new. It's just a current iteration of that experience and us trying to sharpen it up. I'm going to stop there, y'all, just in the interest of time. That was about like 30 minutes, and then try to do, historical overview, but to put it in context to a local meaning of where we fit in now. And to be clear, within the two that we articulated, if you notice, we tried to do a combination of one and two, right? Within the Jackson experience, to make that more concrete, a combination of one and two, not believing that we were anywhere near a stage or had the power to just totally kind of abolish the thing and be away with it, but much more of a stage and phase piece, which I think in a general sense is overall where our forces would land. And if you all remember, let me see if I can, one thing, I haven't done this in a minute, share screen, here we go. Whoever's the host has to enable some screen sharing for a second.
That's a little bit complicated. Melanie, are you able to do that?
Well, anyway,
I'm gonna try one more thing, unless you can wait. No, I can't. This is the new account.
Don't worry about it.
Unless you send it to me. Yeah.
I can try to send it to you. And while that's going on,
you want to start the Q&A?
Well, I mean, just let me go over it and I can send it to you later. So, part of our experience of what we had put out, last October, and part of what I'm working on now is finishing up a writing of this whole piece, but this build and fight formula. And, there was a couple of things that we thought and still think that could be building blocks of a more articulated revolutionary process here in the United States. From things that millions of people are already doing and engaged in that are just not connected, or at least not sufficiently connected, and don't have the organic kind of glue or kind of a revolutionary force or party being able to pull them all together at this point in time. But I think the things articulate, number one, that these things are existing as things that people are doing. That we have to put it together, but be clear why we're putting them together and what's the overall end goal that we could all agree on. But there's a set of practices like mutual aid, food sovereignty. We initially called it cooperative economics. We changed that to worker self-organization, community production, self-defense, and people's assemblies. And those are the things that I would argue, like those are all the different things that put in Gramscian language. Those are critical practices around positioning, right? Got the war position and war maneuver. And that's the war positioning, laying ground, building our capacity, building our forces, transforming consciousness. Then the pieces which articulate the later stage, right, which is, the war maneuver, like direct confrontation with the forces of capital and the state. That's where the general strike came in within that formulation, the effort to democratize the economy from the efforts of the general strike. Because the general strike, I would articulate it, would not just be, let's stop production and leave it there and then negotiate with Amazon, the rest of it. Now, fuck that. What we were trying to do is, we would call for the general strike and then take the next step towards actually seizing and turning those things into cooperative kind of orientations where the workers and everybody within their supply chains are a critical part of the process of re-articulating that. And then when you got to that point, you're at the point of being able to actually seize and actually practice dual power politics, right? And so within that framework of what we laid out, that would be that next step. And then the last piece, what we call free to land, we use that language as part of as cold as, taking over society and succeeding in accomplishing the revolutionary, but to just kind of outline at this point in rhetorical form a way to get to that based upon some of the things that already are existence in place. But if you notice where dual power is, it's one of the last things there that we have to work towards, because we have to have the strength, first and foremost, to be able to pull off something like a general strike before we even think about really raising critical questions about, now that we are at a place where we can conceptualize dual power. What do we do with it? How do we utilize it? So I just want to put that out to kind of put a correcting frame on it, because I think some people are out there utilizing, well, we about dual power. And by that, they mean we just want to create, in general, I would simplify it, kind of like people's assemblies to make autonomous pieces. But like, I would argue, okay, yeah, comrade, that's good that you have something to extend that with, but how does it actually lead us to the transformation of society? Mm-hmm. You can't just leave certain fundamental questions for some negotiated separate space, that we think capital is not going to touch, or the state is not going to smash down on as it builds power, because it is, and we have to prepare ourselves. And something I've been saying for years with folks is like, look, I don't care what side of the anarchist or communist, side of the equation, or revolutionary equation that you fit on, you got to get yourself prepared for this final confrontation with the state and capital, because there is no way around that. At some point, we're going to have to fight them. The question is when and under whose terms.
Excellent. Before we move on to Q&A and conversation, does Saki or anyone else want to put on their
folks are still planning on coming in. I just got a text, but I think folks chime in, other folks, and Saki's been in the background listening, so folks can chime in from there.
And even also, since I can't see the stack and Alita is taking a stack, we're going to ask Sister Alita to just call out who's up, and people can go right ahead and make your comments and questions. So, Alita, please call the list.
Yeah, I put myself on the stack already. I'm the only one there, so I'm going to start. And yeah, I'll do it that way. Yeah, so I think the biggest thing is, you know, the forces in this land where we live are many, and we really just don't know all, as what Kali said, the many ways we have been studying and moving. We just don't know each other. And that's where we are now. And not just, you know, people strike, but what I see and the folks that I've worked in some ways. And so I want to go back to a group, just because we're doing that PMA structure and we're using young people. I want to go back to Free My People. And I want to say Free My People because when we brought these young people together, and this was Boston first, but this was also in the South, we brought the Tenement Square folks. We brought the Burma folks. We brought the Zapatistas. We brought them to these children to dialogue with. You know, and then from that, it was about dialoguing about battle Algiers, the spook who sat by the door. This was our rhetoric. These kids are now grown, right? They were young, and now they're in their at least 20s, 30s, 40s. And so, you know, when I think of that, and then also doing a People's Movement Assembly, our rhetoric is based on, we went to Puerto Rico to talk to political prisoners. We're in unison doing work with them. We went to, you know, we work with the Republic of New Africa, Ahmed and all of them, Bilal. They lead our youth to know this. It's not rhetoric. We, you know, over time, they kept doing this work in the communities that we have the young people. And so when we went to Venezuela and Caracas and he won, you know, everyone took it, right? That is imperative for us to know that there is a difference. I agree with dual power and doing what they're doing now, which is going through the state, if that's what they're doing. But those that have been taught in the ways we teach our youth, and I'm talking about my own kids as well, is that they have set up to know what battle Algiers, what the spook could say about their, what these, what the ultimate thing, even if it means like Curtis Muhammad going to Ethiopia, right? We are in connection with those comrades who are our elders. And I think that's where I feel is important in really knowing who are some of the folks, even in our group here, that know this history, right? And if it's not through a socialist or communist or whatever, you know, free the land philosophy like I had through Goddaddy, you know, Chokwe, it is knowing that that this rhetoric, that this is being taught. And so how do you do that? Time?
Yep.
Shoot, my last point. Can I say my last point? If not, I'll
please do.
Okay, thank you.
No, go ahead.
Thank you. So the biggest part for me is negotiating and bargaining is not okay. You know, even coming out of Richmond, we are door knocking, not to get to the state, not to get to city council, but to get the word to the people about the movement that is besides that, smashing this, freeing the land. And I think not everyone knows how to do that because they haven't had that. But our youth are going to be trained that way because we are trained that way. And I think that's where dual power is not an exception. I mean, it's just not, I hope that we at least are on that same page. That's why I joined anyway. Check. And so far, nobody else is on stack. Is there?
Anybody else on stack?
That seems impossible with such an intense conversation, except maybe we're just, you know, kind of processing it and digesting it. But someone's got to have some comments and questions and something.
Yeah, I'll put myself on stack.
Okay, Rose. Yeah.
Yeah, this goes back to an earlier conversation that the NOC had with Kali about the current political moment and locating this discussion in the context of the nature of the state, the Democratic Party, and the usual suspects. And I'm wondering, Kali, can you share a bit of that because it has a lot of relevance for the strategic direction of People's Strike. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you fine, Rose. I hear you. I'm just laying flat on my back on my little curve machine now because sitting down too long does not bode well for my back. But yeah, I mean, try to recap those pieces. Let me see where to begin. I mean, it's my general read. That basically from, I would say, September on, a significant amount of the institutional forces, and I include most of the so-called social justice nonprofits in that kind of array and alignment, were brought firmly into the Democratic Party's orbit and strategy. Many for their own, kind of ostensible reasons around, we just need to get Trump and the fascists out of, office soon as could be. But a lot of stuff straight up was just bought up, and it's continuing to be bought up in the alignments around, where their agenda is headed. On every front, you see that climate justice. You see it on, their whole kind of notion of racial justice framework. Hell, we started off having a conversation indirectly about Juneteenth, which has been used as a critical part of their strategy around this, making this a federal holiday, to in part as kind of a payoff, to the Black core constituency, which is the foundation of the Democratic Party, at least how it's now presently, constructed and aligned. And that most of these forces, they are in a dynamic which I think is really behind the time, that is really locked into the particular kind of bourgeois framework and orientation of the Democratic Party, which is about, number one, trying to preserve law and order, which is by an extension a way of preserving the empire, and trying to shield it from, this fear of a fascist takeover, which, let's be honest, is well advanced. I don't, it's a particular piece that grows from the American colonial soil, so I don't think that description does it actual justice. I think this is something even more insidious and rooted here and not going nowhere. But, clearly, they can't move those forces. And I saw, me and Bill had a little exchange on Facebook, Bros, that I think highlights this, right? Where the past couple of days, he had mentioned that I had made a statement that it is the left's responsibility, to advance the cause of democracy, right? The struggle for democracy. Mm-hmm. But the struggle for democracy has never meant a struggle to uphold or patronize, or partake in the rituals of bourgeois democracy, right? That we have to expand our scope and understanding of democracy to be something that exceeds the limitations of the bourgeois structure and its rules and kind of regulations and its confines.
Right.
And so he was making an argument that was collapsing, kind of the present quote unquote democratic institutions of the state is something that we don't want to lose, and raise the question like, do we want to hunt down the fascists or not? And I said, Bill, let's be real. The Democrats are not going to smash the fascists, and they're not going to hunt them down.
Exactly.
and if you see the first major thing that came out, the woman agreed, that she played into a rape, and she got probation. So, but this is the piece where I think we are at, and it's kind of missing the time. So, like the biggest phrase that everybody's fear of, like, that all these states are changing the laws. Now, I'm not saying that we shouldn't be concerned with that, but if we think, knowing the history of this country, that having a piece of paper that says we could vote or not vote is going to make a difference at the end of the day when force is the final arbitrator of anything. And this is what I was meaning by coming back to Juneteenth, right? It's a myth that our folks didn't know that they was free, but free in what context? They was like, I ain't got no gun to get this slave master off my back. So I'm going to play it cool until such a time either I can run away or find a way to overthrow these folks. It wasn't until the federal army showed up and made a declaration that the folks knew that there's a contending power. There's another force, that will back us in our move. But then goes back to the whole rhetoric around the Emancipation Proclamation, but people not necessarily recognizing. Technically, the Emancipation Proclamation didn't free a damn person.
Exactly.
Right? Because it was said, those who are in the rebelling states are now free. Right? If the Confederacy was truly autonomous, you can't tell somebody in another state how to deal with their slaves or their subjects or their citizens. That was a war declaration, a war strategy, and people keep confusing the maneuvers of war with actual inclusion within the empire. And like, what are you being used as a tool for? And it brings us back to the present. Like so many of our folks, I think are trying to push for greater inclusion and this voting right and that access. And I'm saying, look, I'm not going to argue with you, negate you about that. But if you think it's not time to start setting up self-defense committees, start setting up autonomous food production, and educating people about, a higher level of struggle and conflict, then you're behind the time on what the right he's actually prepared to position itself to do, because they are there. We are not.
Right. That's right. That's right. We have
the sound is going out a little bit, and I want to keep in mind that there are two other people, and now to do a University Symphonetta's check, just making sure that we allow those on stack to have a surmountable a number of time. So I have Andrea next, and then Melanie.
So I have a gazillion questions. I'm not going to ask them all at once, but first of all, I think I'm not 100% clear. I understand exactly what dual power is, but that's okay. I can do some research. But so I guess a number of questions that I had is, one is curious about why all of this strategy and everything is just rooted in like Marxism or Leninism or socialism, rather than, for example, indigenous models of governance or something like that. And also about the question about how the ruling elites very effectively use race as a weapon. Therefore, what does that mean for our struggle? Like, how do we overcome that? How they're successfully using that? Should our struggle be more rooted in class than race, for example? And because, like, for example, there's an indigenous prophecy about the Rainbow Warriors coming together and being successful, and I think about like Fred Hampton and putting together the Rainbow Coalition. And lastly, why is direct confrontation necessary or better than maneuvering in a more stealthy way? For example, we went and like testified at this committee in the legislature in Louisiana about getting rid of the slavery exception clause. And they totally saw us coming, and they had all their arguments set up, and they already had their minds made up and everything. And so, yeah, just wondering about the difference between, full frontal confrontation or coming at them in a way that they can't outmaneuver us. Check.
I'm going to do a little bit of an interruption here. You're absolutely right, Andrea. You have a slew of questions. Is there any one of those that you put on the table that you'd like Kali to respond to?
Whatever Kali feels
I was
like
going to respond to them all very quickly, actually.
Okay, all right.
Yeah. So what I want you to do, Andrea, look at the situation in Colombia right now. I want you to go look that up and study it. Because there you have some answers, I think, to all of your questions. You have very strong indigenous movements in their own ideological and political frameworks, which are not rooted in kind of they've been influenced by Marx, but they're not necessarily rooted in a Marxist framework that have been growing and very strong. You have very strong Afro communities in Colombia, both on the kind of the north, west coast and on the east coast. Very strong organizing communities, and you have a very strong organized left presence in a longstanding civil war, going on in Colombia. Colombia is in the midst, if you don't know, Colombia is in the mix right now of a total program of state terror that was unleashed against the people, and this was not kind of a broad centralized party that called for this, but basically a broad general strike was called and executed, not uniformly, but executed throughout Colombia to protest all the conditions from this right-wing government. Right. And in full view of, the United States government, and most of these forces, let me put it in context, most of the forces in Colombia now that are out and engaged in the street have kind of disavowed the armed struggle. And what they are learning is that you can disavow it all you want. The state right now still has a monopoly on violence and will use it, right, at the end of the day to be the arbitrator of having control. So I want you to don't look at it as this is us on our end saying that, we want to be violent. The reality of the situation is they maintain control through violence. Now, it can be resolved in a number of different ways. You don't necessarily have to contend with them through armed struggle. I would contend that we probably more likely have to, but that doesn't mean that's the only route to doing it. The question winds up becoming, do we have enough unity once we got to a level and discipline and determination to be prepared to endure the sacrifices of, thousands, maybe even tens of thousands of people getting killed, by the state to totally legitimize it and then weaken the armed forces so that they don't want to be in a position of executing these orders and don't see them as legitimate and either put their guns down or turn them around. So these are things that are not necessarily within the framework of Marxism. I don't want you to look at it that way, right? These are things that what I'm articulating is kind of the dual power dimension of it was the people calling for the general strike and then executing it. And it got to be so strong that the state had to respond with the last tool in its toolkit, which is violence. This is in the here and now. And you see it elsewhere. Another living example where a very successful general strike that hasn't been talked about enough that's been executed within the last 6 months was in Palestine. Right? And you see the response of the state there. So there's just general ways in which this entity reacts to the people whenever it feels threatened that we have to figure out how to deal with. And there's not one way to figure that out. There's usually multiple ways that people, tactics and strategies that people employ. The question winds up become, do they work in sync with each other? To have a consistent end goal and process, to achieve victory, whatever that victory may be, as defined by those people.
Melanie, go ahead.
Okay, also many questions, but thinking about all of what you shared, Kali, in relation to People's Strike, you started to talk just briefly towards the end, last comment around autonomous everything education. You also talked about the responsibility around building the democratic, the struggle for democracy. And I just wonder, in terms of the work that we do through People's Strike, in a way, this is a short, medium, and long term then way of framing how we understand the work that we're doing, which is building relationships now. But are those the points of focus that would bring the strategy of People's Strike along in this next period? Is that what you're suggesting? Just the relationship of DualPower, People's Strike, and those areas of focus in building DualPower.
There's a central piece that sometimes gets overlooked in our own collective history of how we came together and why, right? And part of the kind of leading piece was what the pandemic was doing to the people, the inadequate response, primarily from the state. And then underneath that is the level of reorganization that Capitol is doing on the heels of this pandemic. And whether this was going to, was trying to stop this giving a more free hand to Capitol, I think was a general piece. And all the pieces around moving and advancing towards general strike were in the framework of saying that this provided an opportunity for the right. It provided an opportunity, the Capitol, right, which was this within a right and a liberal framework, and that we needed to make an intervention in this process. Now I'm bringing it back because I think this Delta variant is proving many of the arguments that we were articulating a year ago, almost to the month, that this was going to be a long-term struggle because, the only reason they shut anything down, was to initially kind of halt some things, but they were always aiming towards reorganizing society, reopening society to deal with the economy and accumulation dynamics as quickly as they could, and that we were going to wind up paying for their rush to get back rather than dealing with this in a broad way with the types of reorganization that was ultimately going to be necessary. We still occupy a very unique argument and set of frameworks within that, y'all. I firmly believe that I think we need to go back and articulate and make arguments with a lot of folks within our periphery about, what is needed to meet both the challenge of the moment, since this pandemic hasn't gone anywhere. It's very clear that if you look at some of the cases now from a couple of different countries, that the Delta virus is bypassing, the initial vaccinations. That there's a long-term piece of this that we're going to have to be prepared for. And then there's the spin-off of stuff. There's the stuff around, the organized workshop, the organized work sites. There's the stuff around the housing struggle, that's there. And there's the climate impacts. I think there's still some glue specifically around being clear around, what does the working class and oppressed people need to kind of articulate and fight for in the midst of the overall conditions, and how do we make the argument to folks within our orbit and to the public at large that we need to engage, that we still occupy a very unique position to do. I still think that we need to get prepared to deal with the crises that are coming down the pipeline, and to be more prepared than we were last summer, because we know there's going to be more state repression coming down the hatch, despite whatever rhetoric they put out there or whatever kind of sentence they give to Chauvin, whoever else to kind of modify folks. The state is still the state, the police is still the police. We need to be preparing folks for that and to deal with what's left of, I think, the autonomous energy of what emerged with the Floyd rebellion, because not all of that has been captured. You know, a lot of it has, a lot of it, they throw in resources at folks left and right to contain that energy. But not all of it can be contained, and eventually that water is going to break. And I think we need to be at least just setting up a level of preparedness and education internally and externally, you know, both happening at the same time to get prepared for that. And we need to be engaging, particularly a lot of the younger, not as well organized forces, you know, in the movement. Coming into contact with them is still something I think we're going to constantly be trying to figure out. But you know, making the tools and making those connections is still a critical piece that we have to do within our particular set of positioning. I think for a long-term piece, then the questions around dual power, general strike, you know, become more practical in terms of why we're putting these out there. What are we aiming to do? Why are we trying to make this type of intervention now when people like, you know, y'all so far in the field and so speculative as to be, you know, absurd? We're saying no, in reality, you know, some things are very close to that, and it can either happen spontaneously or it can happen as a result of us doing, you know, the systemic work to get there.